So today I'm just going to introduce to you the essence of my teacher's teaching, Chan teachings, and give you a little background about it. And maybe answer some questions that you may have. Let me get a sense of where you are. Okay, let me get a sense of what your interests are, what you hope to get out of the talk. So, how many of you have never done an intensive Chan retreat practice? Raise your hand. Never done it. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, majority of you have done it. How many of you have done maybe 3 retreats or more? 3 long retreats or more. Okay, about half. Okay. So all of you are interested in Chan. Right? And you know about the history of Chan? A little background history of Chan. Okay. And how many of you have never read my teacher's books on Chan? Okay. 1 person. Okay. 2 or 3. Okay. Thank you. So as you can see, I didn't prepare for this talk. I don't really prepare for my talk. So I just wanted to cater my talk to all of you. So I think what I'm going to do is give you a quick synoptic picture of the role of the Chan tradition within the whole of Buddhism. Okay, the emergence of Chan, the reasons behind it, the cultural background, and then narrow in on my teacher, his role, his placement in this larger scheme of things. And then we'll narrow in on his particular teaching of Chan. Okay, I think that will be, that context will be necessary. Okay. By the way, if you're sitting like far over there, since there are plenty of seats, please just gather together so I don't have to look too far ahead. All right. So naturally, all of you know Buddhism emerged as a tradition 2,500 years ago in India, and it spread to different regions in the globe. Buddhism during that time is the only world religion that spread globally. We're talking about BCE time, 2,500 years ago. In India, in the Indian subcontinent, all the different spiritual traditions, they were not missionary. They were not global. They were regional practices, right? Cultic traditions, spiritual paths. But Buddhism, since the very beginning, and several hundred years after the Buddha's passing, it became the first Indian religion that started to travel beyond India. Okay, so this is unheard of. Okay, it may seem like obvious to us now, but in BCE time, this was the only tradition that traveled outside of India, and had a very clear missionary statement, to save all beings. 2,500 years ago, so basically 500 BCE time, the Buddha was born. By 300 BCE, before the Common Era, India for the first time was unified. under one rule. Prior to that was regional warlords vying for power. Their dominion expanded and shrunk according to the military might of these rulers. But something happened 3rd century BCE. Ashoka, Ayuwang. He was the first king or emperor who unified the whole Indian subcontinent. And his reign actually extended beyond what we now know as India into Pakistan. You know, at that time it would be called, in the BCE time, it would be called the Gandhara era, right? and much more, right? Iran and so on. So after he conquered the whole of India, he was converted to Buddhism. The records has it that he was full of sorrow because he killed so many people. So he converted to Buddhism, and the first thing he did was he had his own son and daughter become monastics. So the first wave of the Buddhist transmission was actually through the influence of Ashoka. Right? So he was converted, he wanted to spread peace. So he had his own children as monastics now, represent him as emissaries to the first transmission wave, South Asia, right, to Sri Lanka. Right? So that happened in 3rd century BCE. And Buddhism flourished in different parts, South Asia, and continued to evolve. Buddhism at that time was not, of course, just like now, was not a stagnant, unchanging religion, homogenized, unified religion. Basically, there's different regional forms of Buddhism emerging and adapting to local cultures. And Buddhists continue to evolve, responding to the challenges of other spiritual traditions and cultural norms. So different forms of Buddhism already began to surface. The clearest instance would be 100 years after the Buddha passed away. Buddhism was already, based on certain records, split into 18, sometimes we can say maybe 20 different sub-sects, schools. And some of these interacted with each other, blended, merged, and responded to each other, and formed later forms of Buddhism. Right? So first transmission, 3rd century BCE. Second transmission, China. Right? That would be 1st century, 2nd century CE. Okay, several hundred years. But something was very unique when it came to China. The Buddhism kept on evolving. There's different forms of Buddhism emerging. And it went to South Asia. It basically just took over. Why? Because South Asian countries didn't even have a language. Their civilization was basically inferior to the Indian rich culture of philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, linguistics. Millenniums of this, BCE, millenniums of this. So Buddhism basically just takes over their language, their political system, everything. But when it came to China, something happened. Now, the Chinese civilization was on par with the Indian civilization. So there you can witness different sparks of contention and negotiation, challenges, right? Chinese cultural tradition, we have our own political system, linguistic, mathematics, and CE time, and we have our own meditation tradition, right? Taoist internal alchemical practices, right? That dates back to the Buddha's time, you see. So civilization footing, then you see clash, and you see negotiation, right? Criticism of Buddhism, and Buddhism had to adapt to the Chinese civilization, and part of that adaptation really sparked the beginnings of Chinese Buddhism. Right? Now, mind you, the complexity is that in India, there was not one form of Buddhism. India, it is still evolving. So when it went to China, it's clashing with Chinese civilization, Chinese spiritual practices, and so on. So there's a lot of this back and forth. Right? And the type of Buddhism that was missionary, strong missionary movement, were kind of more aggressive forms of proselytization. And that form was Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism. Now, Mahayana Buddhism in India has already started to emerge around 1st century BCE. Okay, 1st century BCE. So let's review what we have. The Buddha, 5th century BCE. 3rd century BCE, South Asia. 1st century BCE, new form of Buddhism started to come, called Da Sheng Jiao, right? Mahayana Buddhism. 1st century, 2nd century CE, a couple hundred years after that, second transmission to China. And from China, of course, to Korea, 4th century, Japan, 7, 8. So that's the trajectory. So this more aggressive form of Buddhism, universalist, well, maybe I shouldn't say aggressive, but universalist form of Buddhism was only at its beginning stages in India. Right? So after a couple hundred years, it goes to China. So a lot of interaction here. So because of that, the Chinese reception of Buddhism are predominantly Mahayana. Right? So the other forms is, we do have textual transmissions, but in terms of the actual practice and spiritual outlook, it's basically Mahayana. So meanwhile, in India, Buddhism kept on evolving too. Just to give you a basic overarching history. Tibetan Buddhism, right? 7th, 8th century CE. Very, very late, right? 3rd century BC, South Asia. 4th century CE, Chinese Buddhism. 7th, 8th century Tibetan Buddhism. So by that time, 7th, 8th century in India, that Buddhism already changed its face so many times. That's why Tibetan Buddhism looks so different than Chinese Buddhism or South Asian Buddhism. Does that make sense so far? The reason why all these Buddhism looks so different, because they kind of received this form and they kind of maintained it, right? So back to Chinese Buddhism. Buddhism transmitted to China through the Silk Road, the Silk Route. Right? Now there are many Silk Routes. Right? Under the Taklamakan Desert, and there was a sea route, but basically through the Taklamakan Desert, along this trading route that didn't begin in India, of course, as you know. It begins all the way to the Middle East, right? It's all the way from Middle East, all the way, like Turkey, all the way past through India to China, ended in China, right? So this trade route that lasted for over 1,000 years, over 1,000 years. A lot of exchange of ideas besides material goods. And Buddhism has settled along this route, taking care of its own merchants, right, from Central Asia and India. It's kind of like, you know, how us Chinese, when we go to a foreign country, the first thing we do is establish Chinatown, right? It's basically like that idea. So these Central Asians, the Indians, they just travel along with the merchants to take care of their own people, settle in regions like Dunhuang, which is like New York City, if you will. A metropolis, a lot of ideas, a lot of different traditions coming together and pass by this metropolis, you know, oasis. But a lot of settlement of these different forms of Buddhism, and new generations of young people start to be born in these regions, Central Asians and Indians that were born in China in this trade route. So they're born, just like many of you, bilingual. Right? It was these early translators, it's not that they really traveled from India or Central Asia. They had parents of mixed race, some of them, and they have Chinese names too. You know? So some of them became monks, and because of their linguistic mastery, started to translate Buddhist texts. So this is really what happened in the first century. Now, mind you, it's not a systematic transmission. So what happens is, whatever they wish to translate, that's the form of Buddhism that we have in China. And Buddhism, unlike the Judeo-Christian tradition, basically one Bible, one text, Buddhism have thousands of texts, thousands of scriptures. So if you imagine on the receiving end of Chinese Buddhists, they're getting basically mixed messages, right? Sometimes they're getting this kind of teaching, that teaching, you know, elementary level teaching, very advanced teaching. So the translations are not consistent. It's not like a curriculum that they packaged and then presented to the Chinese. It was ad hoc. So something very unique happened only in Chinese Buddhism, and by extension, Japanese Buddhism, Korean Buddhism. This is called doctrinal classification, 判教思想, 批判佛教. Why do we need doctrinal classification? Because there are thousands of texts. Just imagine, sometimes you get elementary school text, sometimes you get high school text, and then you get college physics, and then sometimes you get like PhD, and then some of the texts are translated. So the receiving end of the Chinese, they're getting all of these different texts. Sometimes talking about emptiness, sometimes talking about existence, karma, you know, fire and brimstone type of talk, you know, bad karma, this and that. And then some other text talking about karma is empty. You know, so they're getting all of these different things. So the Chinese came up with a system. These scholarly monks to classify what is elementary school level Buddhism, what is high school level of Buddhism, what is college level, PhD level. That's basically what 判教思想, doctrinal classification is about. And Buddhism went through its phases, you know, in China. First, the Chinese, really, because they have their own system. of spiritual practice. So they understood Buddhism. It's not like a blank slate, just taking everything. They try to understand Buddhism through the Taoist lens, right? Through Taoism. It's like putting a pair of glasses on, that's Taoism, and try to understand Buddhism. And they went through that phase, and they went through the scholastic phase in which the doctrinal classification began. Really getting to what exactly is Buddhism talking about. This is really not like Taoism. In the beginning, they were thinking it's kind of like Taoism, it's meditation, a contemplative tradition, but it's really, really very different. So early translations of texts are, many are just wrong translations. For example, they translate the Buddha as the great immortal, 大仙,仙人的仙. Totally wrong. The Buddha and the Buddhist path have nothing to do with immortality. Nothing, right? So early translation, you have these very strange ideas imputed on Buddhism. It's because they're wearing the lens of indigenous tradition, trying to understand what this Buddhism is about. So by the time 4th century, 5th century, 6th century, that's several hundreds of years. This is what I call the phase of scholasticism. A lot of doctrinal classification system. Some of you may have heard the Tiantai tradition, right? Or the 地论宗, right? Or 三论宗. All of these are just doctrinal classification systems. And of course, Huayan Zong after Tiantai. So Chan, now we talk about Chan. Chanzong, was an emergent tradition, a countercultural, counter-mainstream, because 400, 500, 600 years later, Buddhism is already mainstream in China. Right? All the intellectuals, the best minds, were just really flourished, made Buddhism flourish. So it was a mainstream religious tradition in China. So by that time, Buddhism has become so scholastic. Chan tradition was a counter-mainstream tradition, was a reactionary movement against scholasticism, scholastic Buddhism. That's why Chan says it's a teaching outside of scriptures. 教外别传. It's a path directly point to the human heart, to the mind. 直指人心, right? So that we can directly grasp the true nature, who we are, and become a Buddha. Right? Now, of course, the 教外别传,直指人心, 这个见性成佛, right? 怎么只有3个呢？不立文字啊，不立文字，教外别传，直指人心，见性成佛。So I missed one. This is the 4th axiom. So not established on words and letters, because that's what the scholars do, words and letters. Yes, a little bit later. Not established on words and letters. And a teaching outside of the scriptures, direct pointing to the human heart, becoming a Buddha, seeing your self-nature. Right? So it was only in the context of doctrine, you get it? That Chan developed a position. It can't exist by itself. It was in response to this earlier form of Buddhism. So Chan began to flourish, beginning maybe 6th century, 7. By the 12th century, it became arguably the most powerful form of Buddhism. And that's when it went to, like Chan, okay, went to Korea and Japan. Right? Of course, earlier form of Buddhism also went to Korea and Japan, like I said before, but Chan. So this is the context that Chan developed its teachings. Right? Now, fast forward over 1,000 years, okay, to my teacher. So Chan has always been known as this tradition focused on direct experiencing of the Buddhist path, meditation school, not caught up with words and language and scriptural stuff. But the 20th century is very different. When Buddhism came to the United States, just like Buddhism of the past, whenever Buddhism went to different regions, the region is culturally, politically, philosophically inferior. Buddhism basically just takes over. Okay, like Tibet, 7th, 8th century, they don't even have written language. Buddhism just takes over. Right? If you think about it, it's very late, 7th, 8th century, and they don't even have written language, right? So Buddhism, and then South Asia, 3rd century BCE, long time ago, of course, just takes over. But 20th century, now Buddhism come to the West. Sophisticated, right? The glasses is not Taoism anymore in China. The glasses is science, right? Capitalism, and so on. So, and the religious background is Judeo-Christian tradition. So Buddhism had to respond to these traditions in the early part of the 20th century. Yeah? So by the time my teacher came to the West in the late 70s, 1976, he caught the tail end of, the most fashionable thing to do among the Beat generation hippies, which is Zen, So he caught the tail end of it. And these Westerners, long hair, they really want to study meditation. Meanwhile, my teacher just came from Japan, got his PhD, so he was an intellectual. So he wasn't really like a charm master, but somehow he ended up teaching meditation because these Americans want to learn meditation. Now, was he qualified as a Chan Zen teacher? Yes. He had his first powerful experience age 28, where he directly experienced the Dharma of his mind. Like what I said, the 4 axioms, beyond words and language, not establish some doctrine, directly pointing at the mind, see yourself, nature, becoming a Buddha. The Buddha in principle, not like Shakyamuni Buddha 2,500 years ago. That which is, in other words, free within each and every one of you. That's the name, that's the meaning of Buddha. Awake, to wake up from our slumber of our dreams and to see who we truly are. So at age 28, he already had that experience. And he entered into solitary retreat. But Master Sheng was always very studious. And he had a very strong inclination to Buddhist scholasticism, really. Buddhist scholasticism. Perhaps partly because he was denied study when he was young. His family was too poor to let him continue to study. Yet he really wanted to. Maybe that had some influence on him wanting to study. So, as you all know, probably, if not, he became a monk at age 13, basically because of poverty. The family just offered him. And it was there that he only had fourth grade kind of official education. Right? And then he studied by himself in the monastery, was very studious, and was the first PhD monk that went through the modern education in the whole of Chinese Buddhist history. I don't know if you know that. So in the whole of Chinese Buddhist history, 2,000 years, he's the first PhD monk that went through the system. Now, Master Yin Shun also has a PhD. He didn't go through the system. He got a PhD because my teacher brought his book to Japanese university. It was an honorary PhD. Do you know what honorary PhD is? Oh, this book is great. Let's give him free PhD. Just like Dalai Lama. Dalai Lama has so many free PhDs, from Emory University, from all these different universities. So Master Sheng was the first one who went through the education system. So he always had this knack, and somehow he ended up just in New York and just teaching meditation. So he was qualified, but this wasn't really where his heart was at. Yet, my teacher was one who followed causes and conditions. So he adapted to his conditions and developed a path for himself. He's always wanted to uplift the educational level of Chinese Buddhists. Because after the Ming Dynasty, late Ming, Qing Dynasty, we're talking about 17th, 18th, 19th century, Buddhism in China was on the decline. And that was the form of Buddhism that funneled into the Republican era after 1911, which is the fall of the Qing Dynasty. Right? That funneled into the Republican era, and before the communists takeover in 1949, it was just, again, like warlords, and then emerging kind of political parties. So turmoil. He was born in this kind of turmoil. Japanese colonization also during that time. So he was born in turmoil, and what he witnessed was a decline of Chinese Buddhism. Desperately needed to be reformed. So what I'm trying to say is, my teacher, even though today's talk is Chan, my teacher, Master Sheng, he's not like an ordinary Chan Zen teacher, just teach meditation. He was a thinker. He can be considered, in 20th century, one of the most important, maybe because I'm his student, I would argue he was one of the 2 or 3 possibly important thinkers in the history of 20th century Chinese Buddhism. Other teachers, not to criticize them, but they basically continue the age-old tradition of Chinese Buddhism, the ritual practices, the traditional scheme of Buddhist doctrine. But they had no original thinking of synthesizing, grafting new forms of thought. You don't see that. In fact, you don't really see that. You can even push back to the late Ming Dynasty, 16th, 17th century onward. You don't see real new formulations, new insight and visions of Chinese Buddhism. And here I'd like to post something that he has drafted in 1998. And the reason I talked about doctrinal classification Panjiao, because this, during the 4th to the 6th century, was the distinctive, unique feature of Chinese Buddhism that's different from every type of Buddhism. It's called Panjiao Sixiang. You don't see that in other forms of Buddhism. And what my teacher did in 1998 was he formulated a new version of Panjiao Sixiang that not only synthesized existing Chinese Buddhist thought, but also Indian Buddhist thought. He incorporated within his own system earlier Panjiao thought. Yeah. So it's a little difficult because I can't even see it from here. Let's see. Okay, that's the last page. All right. So maybe I am going to begin with the first page. So is there a way for me to control the moving of the slides? Okay. So let me fill you in on some details while this is going on. 20th century thinkers, Buddhist thinkers. Slide. Okay, good job. But is there a clicker that I can use or no? No. Okay. All right. So that's fine. This. That's the pointer. Okay. Excellent. Thank you. All right. I know you're all fascinated with this, but please look this way. I gotta explain this because this is 太密密麻麻的. This is too complicated. So I'm gonna simplify here. So look this way. And I'll just jump through this, okay? So I want to clarify what I said. Contemporary Buddhism, 20th century in Taiwan, in mainland China, and 21st century Buddhism, large Buddhist institutions. Most institutions basically continue what they have always been doing. Chinese Buddhism, reciting the Buddha's name, do some rituals and meditate a little bit, scriptural study. This is the norm. Right? There's no real thinkers that synthesize thought, develop new visions. And furthermore, there's no one that felt the threat, the crisis of Chinese Buddhism. Because most Buddhists, when they spread Buddhism to the West, they end up in Chinatowns. They don't actually engage. Even if they're among places like this, it's mostly Chinese speakers. They don't really engage with Western religions, right? Interfaith dialogues. They don't really see the role of Chinese Buddhism in the face of other world religions. If you step back and look at the role of Chinese Buddhism, it's actually the weakest form of Buddhism, the weakest form of Buddhism in the world, globally, especially in the West. Right? What is the most popular form of Buddhism that you see everywhere? Maybe South Asian Buddhism, which had already given rise to a new form of Western Buddhist insight movement, insight meditation movement. Tibetan Buddhism, everywhere. Right? These other forms, regional form of Buddhism, they don't have a Chinatown like the Tibetan exile. First thing they do when they go to West is they learn English. They don't establish Tibetan town. Right? So they become deeply rooted in the West. huge centers. And us Chinese, form of Buddhism, we're very insular, insulated. That's a danger. That's a danger. Because the more insulated you will lack creativity because you lack stimulation with other forms of Buddhism, challenges, meeting contemporary times. So you just routinely go about your own way for hundreds of years doing the same old thing. My teacher felt that crisis. Why did he feel it? Because he came here in 1976. 1977, he sees the flourishing of Japanese Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, South Asian Buddhism, and then Chinese Buddhism, basically two people. In the West Coast, Master Sheng, and on the East Coast was him. And Master Sheng passed away decades ago. Who else actually published in English? Zero. That's a crisis. You all understand that, right? That's a crisis for the fate of Buddhism in the world. We can't just stay in Taiwan, this little puny little place, Taiwan, have the Taiwan mentality, or even China. China before 1980 basically was closed. And when it opens, it kept a close eye on the development of Buddhism. So it's not really, I wouldn't say flourishing, right? So it's a crisis. So my teacher, when he saw this, no one else was propagating Han Transmission of Buddhism, like the Han Buddhist tradition, I mean, all the Chinese people, we are Han. What are you talking about? He was talking about Han in the face of non-Han forms of Buddhism. Do you understand that? And 1980, 1990, other form of Buddhism came to Taiwan. It was a threat. Everyone thought that, oh, South Asian Buddhism was much better than our Chinese Buddhism. Other people's grass is much greener than ours. You know? So 1990s, when South Asian Buddhism started to translate wave after wave after wave of Chinese translation of this South Asian teaching, Theravada Buddhism, hundreds and thousands of Chinese Buddhists converted. Mid-1990s into late 1990s, another wave came, Tibetan Buddhism. Why? Because Taiwan became the jackpot, the financial support for India Dharamsalas, Tibetan refugee Buddhism. So that's like the first stop. All these Tibetan lamas, they just go there, fundraise. Another threat, second threat. Meanwhile, most Chinese masters, you will not find any Chinese masters, Zen or not, teaching about the survival of Chinese Buddhism. Everyone, 守门户, guarded their doors, and we're just going to do this, I'm going to gather my followers, we're just going to do the recitation, ritual practice, we're going to do the scripture study. No one was talking about the crisis of Chinese Buddhism. My teacher began, and he started to synthesize what is the richness of Chinese Buddhism, to such an extent that when the Dalai Lama, Taiwan, very important, strategically, politically, strategically for the spread, for his vision, wanted to have a dialogue with a Chinese master, automatically my teacher was chosen. He was the only global Buddhist that represented Buddhism globally, anywhere in Rome with the Pope. I was there, I was his attendant. In Europe, in the United States. So 98 came along, being his attendant and being his kind of secretary, assisted him. I worked with the Tibet House in New York to host a dialogue between my teacher and the Dalai Lama in New York, 1998. Right? So, in preparation for that, Tibetan Buddhism is very rich tradition, systematized, very structured, full of stages of practice. Right? Chan, no stages, not dependent on words and language. So my teacher, being a kind of scholar too, formulated this chant. He wanted to show that Chan is actually the pinnacle, the fruition of centuries of development of Chinese doctrinal Buddhism. So beginning with Indian Buddhism, center. So you see, beginning with early Buddhism, this is his Panjiao Sixiang, his doctrinal classification. The early Buddhist text, how it developed into Mahayana Buddhism. Right? I'm just going to skip a lot of the details. Basically, in this direction, developed into Madhyamika. Right? 中观思想. Downwardly here, developed into consciousness only, or Yogacara thought. Right? Both of which are kind of early Mahayana. And you have examples of texts that's tied to each of these traditions. And next slide. Okay. How they came to China. Remember? Do you remember what century Buddhism transmitted to China? Quiz, test. First century, second century. Right. By the 4th, 5th, 6th century, doctrinal classification came out, right? So this is an example of one such doctrinal classification. Now it's incorporated into my teacher's own doctrinal classification. So there are reasons why he selects certain types of doctrine to be part of his integrated form of Buddhism. This is what I'm talking about. Elementary school level Buddhism, and high school level, and then college level, and PhD level. So each one progressively more profound, deeper level. Right? And in terms of doctrine, and in terms of practice. And this is something very distinct, because earlier form of doctrinal classification, Panjiao Sixiang, the people there were trying to figure out what the doctrine is, right? But my teacher, we're in the 20th century. My teacher's not into just the doctrine. Earlier form of doctrinal classification never have integrated systems of practice. You see? Practice. So he's synthesizing the best of the Huayan teaching, best of the Tiantai teaching in this slide, and what is distinctive of the methods of practice. Later on, when we go to Chan, he will kind of bring all these loose ends together. Why is it so important in Chan? Next slide, please. Okay. Yeah, this is Huayan. So this particular, each of these schools, Tiantai Zhong, Huayan Zhong, they have multiple types of doctrinal classification. So my teacher just chose this one because it's quite important. This one is by Fa Zhang Dashi. Because this one begins to show the placement of the sudden teaching, 顿教, which is the role of Chan in the whole development of Mahayana Buddhism in Chinese Buddhist conception. And what does that say? 圆教 ma? Yeah. 圆教, the perfect teaching. And the southern teaching, early Mahayana, elementary Mahayana, early teaching. So in terms of the doctrine, he used Fa Zhang's formulation. In terms of practice, you have to shrink the slide because one level is missing in the practice, the bottom one. Down here it should be, down here. What does that say? Can someone read it to me? 是法界, okay. All right. 这是法界观, 观门. So, very distinctive Huayan teaching on actual practice. I actually mentioned this during the retreat. I don't know if some of you were on this past week's retreat. I spoke about 4 types of non-obstruction. 外, 四外法, right? That's from Huayan. Non-obstruction with regard to phenomena. Now, most of us are just obstructed with phenomena. 人事物, interacting with people, and dealing with affairs, we're just vexed, right? Give rise to vexation. So the first level of practice is really, not that, please go back. Okay. Is that this? I can't read it. Is that so? Okay. So basically, very simply, it just means, there's a set of practices that deal with how not to be caught up, not to be obstructed in our day-to-day lives, handling, different affairs and interacting with people. That's 事无碍, right? Non-obstruction with regard to phenomena. Next one is 理无碍, which is non-obstruction with regards to the principal core message of Buddhism, which is emptiness. It could be said this emptiness is also wonderful existence. For example, the pair of glasses. Glasses is made up of non-glasses, right? Because glasses is made out of plastic, there's some metal parts in here, there's a lens. So all of these things come together to make a pair of glasses. So in a pair of glasses, we can connect to all kinds of things. The factory that made it, the people involved in the factory. So now this is just a pair of glasses, but if a person realizes 理无碍 or awaken 悟道理无碍, what they realize is actually we are intimately connected with all things. That's why wisdom, 智慧, wisdom is identical to compassion. Right? The intimate connection with all beings. Right? So the wisdom of no self is actually about emptiness. But emptiness is really about relationships, interconnectedness. Do you understand? So, doctrinally, they can explain it to very complicated. But experientially, when a person is awakened, selfless, it's not vacuity, nothingness. It's actually the connectivity with all beings. That's why wisdom and compassion is the same. Right? So this is the second part about non-obstruction with regard to the core teaching of Buddhism. Emptiness. Next one is, for example, 理事无碍, non-obstruction with regards to principle and phenomena. This is the distinctive Mahayana teaching in which phenomena no longer obstructs selflessness. Right? It is precisely in the midst of difficulties, annoying people, problems that we run into in life, that wisdom and compassion can manifest. Right? You can't perfect patience if there are no annoying people, right? So this is the Mahayana teaching of samsara and nirvana. Samsara, 娑婆世界, is the playground through which a practitioner realizes nirvana. So, 事 and 理 why? You follow so far? So this is a distinctive Mahayana. And then the last one, which is the most difficult to understand, is how all things in and of themselves, all phenomena in and of themselves, do not obstruct each other. Do not obstruct each other. It's very difficult because all we see are obstructions. So I'm going to skip that part. It's kind of difficult. I don't want to focus on that. But I do want to talk about how he highlighted doctrine and practice. And then next slide, please. And then we begin to see his formulation of Chan. Now, all this is in preparation with the Dalai Lama dialogue, that he prepared this chart to show that Chan is the fulfillment of millenniums of the development of Chinese Buddhism, which absorbed thousands of years of Indian Buddhism. Right? So that's why you see here, Chan, Zen, Chan, is the accumulation and culmination. 禅是所有汉传佛教的集成。So it's basically, if you imagine a pyramid, right? The early Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, and then on the top of the pyramid, Chan. That's how he placed Chan. So his form of Chan is not the Chan that's independent from words and language, a teaching outside scripture. It's not that form of Chan. It's the Chan that's built on top of all of the accumulation, all the richness of Buddhism. So in this chart, you see, how he integrates early Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and in terms of the Chan teaching and practice, expedient means, in terms of the teaching, it integrates all the earlier doctrinal classification on the earlier pages, integrate all the different scriptures, how it's linked, and in terms of practice, it's organized based on precept, meditation, and wisdom. And Chan being flexible, embracing, which is a very distinct Chinese cultural feature. The Chinese are, just like the Chinese language, it's inclusive, right? And its adaptability is very high. Same thing with the form of practice that he has developed. Under this rubric of precept, meditation, and wisdom, it includes early forms of understanding of precepts and Mahayana forms. In terms of the meditation, it's also inclusive of sequential form of meditation and sudden Chan approach to meditation. And wisdom, of course, includes all the richness of the early teachings. Next slide. Now, in terms of the practice, this is where we're at. Now, all of you who have come on retreats here, who have read Master Sheng's work, you would know that his Chan teachings basically can be summarized as two distinct methods: silent illumination and Huatong, right? Koan, right? And that's what you see here. But behind these two distinct methods, now you know the richness of doctrine and development of why this is a culmination. Right? So it's not just simply silent illumination. Silent illumination is built on top of, in his conception at least, the richness, the genius of the Chinese Tiantai tradition and Huayan tradition. Right? It outlines it in this chart. And the Tiantai and Huayan tradition is the Chinese synthesis of all the richness of early Indian Buddhism. So it could be approached very simply, this method, that method. But if you want to go deep, you can go in great depth into understanding these two methods. Now, when he first came to America, he actually taught this way of meditation, the first type, which is sudden. In the immediacy of applying the method, suddenly drop off, mind, consciousness, and all the discursive, discriminating thoughts. Right? He has this approach, but that was very hard. So then he developed, methods that actually uses poison against poison. So in his conception, silent illumination and 话头公案 is actually 以毒攻毒的，以妄修妄的， right? It's poison against poison, because the most sudden approach is actually this one. Free from expedient means, 没有方便刺激的，这是纯粹的禅。It's kind of a pure form of charm. But in order so people get a handle on it, use delusion to free yourself from delusion. So these two distinct methods. And as for daily life, this one. 现前一念心, the immediacy of the present moment, the present thought, which is grounded in Tiantai Buddhism. Tiantai Buddhism. I'm not going to go into developing that. I actually have a book coming out. Besides being a Buddhist teacher, a Chan teacher, I also wear the hat of a Buddhist scholar. So I have a book coming out, an academic book on my teacher's thought, the evolution of Master Sheng's thought and the Dharma Drum lineage. In that book, maybe in the future it will be translated into Chinese. In that book, I unpack systematically this whole chart. And I historicize his life and the circumstances through which, meeting Dalai Lama and so on, in which he actually drafted this chart. This chart was never meant to be published. It was on a piece of fax paper that he wrote, handwritten. So in my book, I also have that faxed up version of that, and bilingual. So that book is really centering on the historical circumstances through which he formulated this, which was really just notes to himself in preparation for the dialogue, how he would see Chan, place Chan, because his dialogue was called the wisdom teachings, the best of the Tibetan tradition, the best of the East Asian tradition, Chinese tradition. It's very high level. If you actually search YouTube, you can find that dialogue. So that's basically the chart. And with regards to the details of this chart, if you have questions, I can take some questions now, or I can continue to talk. Which one would you like? Okay, maybe I'll talk a little bit, kill some time, while you can kind of think about some questions to ask me, right? So what we typically know of our teacher, Master Sheng, what I've done in this talk is to, talk about the emergence of doctrinal classification, why doctrinal classification emerged in Chinese Buddhism, right? Because all kinds of texts are translated, and the Chinese are getting confused. Sometimes they get very easy Buddhism, sometimes they get very hard, so they place it in a chart form. I also talked about what Master Sheng faced, the circumstances, which is, meeting the Dalai Lama, representing the whole of Chinese Buddhism, and he wished to share with the world the richness of the Chinese Buddhist tradition, right? Han Transmission. And being a Chan teacher, he placed on the top of the pyramid Chan, and he built the scaffoldings of the foundations of what is behind Chan. And what is behind Chan are millenniums of development of Buddhist thought. So it's not just a teaching that's get rid of words and language, direct pointing, becoming a Buddha, so on and so forth. Sounds very easy, but it's actually a very, very rich tradition. And he was the only person that could really do it in our times. He had, because of his academic studies, because of the ability for him to synthesize thought, for Chinese Buddhism, at least synthesize these thoughts and bring it to fruition. Right? And in response, and the whole purpose was really to, in hope that Chinese Buddhism would flourish, overcome our current dilemma, crisis of being the weakest link in every form of Buddhism there is now. Right? So his vision was vast, far-reaching. In order for the survival of Chinese Buddhism, you really need to reinsert the doctrines back into Chan and use that Chan as the vehicle to flourish 整体的汉传佛教, the whole of Han Chinese Buddhism. Does that make sense? Chan would be the face of Chinese Buddhism. And all of this is the richness. Right? And it's up to us to unpack this teaching, to make it flourish. All the richness of Chinese Buddhism. Now, if you look at Chinese Buddhism these days, no one's really teaching Tiantai Buddhism or Huayan Buddhism. If they are teaching, it's only in Chinese. Right? It's not global. It's not global Buddhism. Yet we live in a global time. Right? We can't be so insular. So we have to bring the richness out beyond the monastic walls into the world to make it relevant. Right? So he has given us traces of what to highlight in Tiantai, what to focus on in Huayan, what to study so that we can follow his footsteps to unpack the richness, to kind of revive the richness of Chinese Buddhism. Now, after 98, you will see a pattern in his publication. He started to unpack Tiantai, Huayan, Wei Shi, and all these different traditions in this chart. So it's not. So we don't need to rely on just this chart, which will be published in my book. But he has independent books on Tiantai, so you can kind of see how Tiantai places in this larger scheme of things, and then go in deep. Does that make sense? Right? And Huayan teaching and Chan teachings. So this until he passed away in 2009. So from 98, he started to unpack this chart, basically, in his publication of books. So, this is what I wanted to share with all of you about what is Master Sheng's Chan thought. What is that? Yes, it's two methods, but behind that is this rich tradition. And his intention, you could say, is not really to propagate Chan. His kind of unspoken intention is actually to flourish Chinese Buddhism, Han Buddhism. Chan is just it's a front. Right? It's a front. Because this form of Chan is definitely not the Chan that we read in books of the pre-modern time. They don't talk about this doctrine. They don't do that. So it's like Chan got rid of doctrine. They had to, because everyone was scholastic Buddhism, right? So Chan got rid of it. So what my teacher did is put it back. Why? Because modern people need the foundation. He reinserted it and presented Chan as the richest tradition within the whole, or a relative tradition within the whole Chinese Buddhism. So everyone can follow this overarching kind of scheme. So if anyone asks you, what is the Chan teaching of Master Sheng? You can say, his Chan teaching embodies the richness of the whole Buddhist tradition. How? There's a book that's going to be out. You can look at it. So, thank you.